Hi folks, Matt Easton here. So in a number of videos in the comments underneath, people have questioned why you might carry a one-handed sword rather than a long sword. And more specifically, why you would not use the long sword with a buckler or shield. Very clearly, the one-handed sword can be used with a buckler or a shield. The long sword physically can be, but is usually not. Now, why might that be? Well, there's many reasons why you might carry a one-handed sword with your buckler or shield in preference to a long sword. Firstly, quite simply, one-handed swords were cheaper. Okay, so I don't have values to reel off to you right now, but your average price of a longsword was generally a higher status weapon and was therefore more expensive than a one-handed sword. Clearly there's less metal in them, but also longswords tended to be made for higher status customers. But of course, they could be made for anyone. You could make a longer hilt on a one-handed sword, but I'll get to that in a moment. Secondly, the one-handed sword, quite simply, is a better one-handed weapon than a longsword. Okay? Most longswords are made to predominantly be used in two hands. Because you are using them in two hands, you can have more blade length, you can manage more blade length, so the blades tend to be made longer. If you are using your sword two-handed but you only have a one-handed length blade, you're kind of selling yourself short. Whilst you might have a weapon that you can use for a bit longer and maybe use a little bit more quickly because you've got two arms attached to it instead of one arm, you're missing out on the reach advantage of a longsword. When you use a weapon with two hands, you can manage more length. So the longsword tends to be made longer. Okay? Now, if I swap hands here, if you just take a longsword, yes, you can use it relatively nimbly to defend, bam, and attack in one hand. Okay, this is the Albion Ringneck. You can look up the stats online if you're curious. I can use this in one hand, however, it is nowhere near as nimble as a one-handed sword is at just moving around, whether I'm cutting or defending or riposting. Okay, so the one-handed sword is much more nimble in one hand than a longsword is, because of course the longsword is made longer and a bit heavier because you're going to be using it in two hands most of the time. So generally speaking, apart from economy, and sometimes law comes into it, in certain places common people weren't allowed to carry a longsword, they were only allowed to carry a one-handed sword, or indeed in some places only a messer, gross messer. I'll talk about that in a different video, but apart from law and money, quite simply a one-handed sword is a better one-handed weapon than a longsword is. Okay? So if you're predominantly going to be fighting with a shield or a buckler, or indeed fighting from horseback, the one-handed sword is, generally speaking, a better choice because it's lighter, it's easier to carry, and it's actually better as a weapon in one hand. Additionally, wearing the weapon. So I just mentioned it's easier to carry. Why? Well, partly because it's lighter, partly because the blade is shorter, but also look at the hilts. Okay, now imagine I'm wearing, I know you can't see this low, but imagine I'm wearing either of these swords. Look at the hilt sticking out with each of them. Okay, the longsword is a pain in the butt to wear. Not only do you have more blades sticking out behind, but you have more hilt sticking out in front. So quite simply, it's more inconvenient to wear. And remember, if you're mounting and dismounting horses, this can be an issue as well. And in fact, if you are as likely to use the sword on horseback as on foot, and you can't really, although it's shown a few times in medieval art, you can't generally speaking use a sword two-handed on horseback because your left hand is controlling the reins of the horse. So only your right hand is free for a weapon, and therefore a one-handed sword is generally a better choice. Okay, so those are the general reasons why you would pick a one-handed sword over a longsword if you're intending to fight on horseback, or indeed using a shield or a buckler in your other hand. Now, some people might retort to these points quite fairly with the point of, why don't you have a one-handed sword blade with a longer hilt, a hilt that you can hold two-handed? Well, there's a couple of answers to that. One is that a longer hilt will get in the way when you're using the sword one-handed. Partly when you're wearing it, as I just mentioned, it will stick out further. But also when you're using the sword, just swap hands again, when you're using the sword one-handed, if you have a long hilt sticking out behind, if you're used to it, it's okay, but it can kind of get in the way. Incidentally, if an opponent grapples you, it's also a lot of handle for them to grab onto and pull the sword out of your grip. You can in fact use this extended grip for hooking motions and in grappling techniques, and it's shown with the mesa, and in fact mesas do often have a longer handle sticking out at the end there, despite the fact that they're usually used one-handed. So you could have a longer handle on a one-handed blade, and it was sometimes done, and in fact if you look at Paulus Cowell's treatise and look at the sword and buckler section, it looks like in the sword and buckler he is in fact using exactly this. It looks like a short longsword. In other words, the blade looks about one-handed length, but the hilt is longer than a normal one-handed sword. But generally speaking, it does mean that you're paying more, essentially, for more weapon, for a longer handle that you're rarely going to use, and it sticks out more and is a bit more inconvenient, both in wearing and in actual use. And lastly, I would say, let's put the longsword down for a minute, if you really want to, with one-handed swords that do have a one-hand grip, you can still grab them with two hands. And this is shown in medieval artwork and mentioned in text sources. So with this is the Albion Poitiers. It's a relatively small sword. I can take those two fingers, put them over there, the rest of my fingers go around the pommel, and I can actually use this quite easily like a little longsword now, if I need to. Okay, so I can quite happily hold that pommel with my left hand with one or two fingers above it and the rest around it, and it's quite comfortable, and I can actually fit both hands onto this grip despite the fact it's not a very big grip. Even if you have a shorter hilt, and this is actually shown in some Viking and Anglo-Saxon period sources, even if you have one of those early sort of, Dark Age really short hilts, you can just hold both hands together and use the weapon like this. Okay, now that's not shown in any treatises, but it is shown in medieval artwork, so it was clearly done, and it's mentioned at least in one of the Icelandic sagas where it says that someone used a sword two-handed, and clearly they're using a Viking sword, so they must have pretty much been doing this. So there we go, there's some thoughts about why you would pick a one-handed sword over a long sword for certain situations, and of course why you might not necessarily need to have a long hilt on your one-handed sword if very, very occasionally you want to use your one-handed sword in two hands. Okay, cheers.